Good morning, everyone. Welcome,
Good
welcome
morning.
to We Charge Colonialism. You're tuned in. We Charge Colonialism, anti-colonial think tank and media, and we have a great program lined up for everyone today. So I'm not going to take people's time away from all the good information we have. So I'm going to jump it over to Toivo.
Hey, how y'all doing? Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We got people all over the world, hopefully, who are tuning into this. So thank you for being with us. So again, to get right to it, given we started a little bit late, apologies for that. My name is Toivo Asheke. I'm a scholar activist who's based currently here in Atlanta, Georgia. I have roots in Namibia and in Black America, and this work has very much been my life. So we are here to discuss. As all of you know, 2024 was the year of elections everywhere, right? Europe, African continent, the US, Asia. I mean, there's been elections everywhere, right? So there's, of course, a bunch that we could talk about, but just given my own particular interests, expertise, personal connections, given my Namibian background on my father's side and my deep integration and politicization with the occupied Azanian struggle in South Africa and wider Southern Africa. We're going to focus today on Namibia and South Africa, and we have some guests who are from these places, have been mobilizing in these places, and are part of a younger, newer generation, right? Who is politically left and politically progressive, but is seeing things differently from an older generation, right? Particularly some of us in Namibia and South Africa. For those who do know and do have some of the memories of the anti-apartheid struggle, we gained independence, if you will. Walter Rodney called it flag independence in 1990, Namibia, and 1994, South Africa, respectively. Now, we can disagree with a bunch of other things. Many of us in the Black nationalist position will say we are still occupied and we are still under colonialism, and that argument is there and we represent that. But just in some broad terms, there is something to say about some of that compared to your Ghanas, your Kenyas, Nigerias, and others who got independence at a different point in time. So we're just going to analyze some of these election results in Namibia and South Africa. We will start with South Africa, what we will call occupied Azania. I'm here with my colleague Phurah Jack, who I met in some of the Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall protest movements in occupied Azania in the mid 2010s, and we joined the same. I joined their political movement, Black First, Land First, and we've been mobilizing and thinking together for years now. So, Phurah, I'm just going to kick it over to you just so you can give a brief introduction, and then we're going to start with about a 15-minute, just nuts and bolts analysis for people of what happened in South Africa, and then in our next hour we will talk about Namibia. For those of you who know, the South Africa, the ruling party has been since 1994, the African National Congress, and in Namibia, it has been SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization. Okay, so I'm going to kick it to Phurah just for a brief introduction, and then I'm going to jump into just some basics, numbers and stats from the South African election, and then I'll kick it back to Phurah for you to maybe fill in some blanks and give us some details. And then Natasha, any questions, thoughts, please. If we get anything within the chat boxes, please send those questions through. And then we're going to transition to a second portion where then we will go deeper into an analysis of what does this mean and why is it important and why bluntly is the ANC's move a sellout move that many of us saw coming years ago. So Phurah, please.
Just to introduce myself, my name is Upumzile Jack, um, uh, but I'm known as Phurah Jack, a member of Black Consciousness Movement. But before that, before Black First Land First, we come from unemployed people's movement, landlessness people's movement, Black Wash, September National Imbizo, Black First Land First. This is a Black consciousness movement, we believe, the only Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And then we're part of EFF, of course, and when in its inception until they until they chased us out, they expelled us. We are the first Black consciousness, or we are the first movement in South Africa post 94 that has suffered what I call uh, a band at some point, Toivo, I'm not sure if you remember, Black Festland Fest was banned in South Africa. Um, this is now, not now, post 1994. Yes, and then we then decided to join the Umkhonto weSizwe led by the former president Jacob Zuma. So today's analysis, for me, they're not going to come from a position, oh my god, I'm a member of this movement and I think this is how things should be, but it will be a holistic analysis of the importance of what I call um, the um, the participation in politics and elections, and because it's really important that we really analyze the post 94, what it means to partake in elections. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, Pura, thank you so much for that. For that. Okay,
Yeah.
so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen briefly. Those of you who know me know I love my maps. And sometimes I can't think straight if I don't have my maps. So let me see if I can share this screen. Just let me
Yeah.
know, if you guys can see this, when I put it up. Let's see. There we are. Share. Are you guys able to see this map?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, folks. So just as how I like to think about these things. This is what we call South Africa, what you will call South Africa. Lesotho, Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, is here. Botswana here. Namibia, where I'm
Namibia.
from, is here. Right? Zimbabwe, for those of you who want to know, here. Mozambique, which is also going through a number of its own political tensions right now with some of the liberation movements in power, is here. Okay, and Angola, Zambia, etc. This broadly, this area for folks is what we would call Southern Africa, broadly, right?
Sorry.
Of course, East Africa, we'll cut into this. And of course, we can talk about Central, West, and North, right? So, what we're going to be focusing on
Can
in
you
this
zoom
first
in a little
hour
bit,
is
Toivo?
South
Sorry.
Africa.
Can you zoom in just a little bit to the people?
I will absolutely zoom in. And can someone on that end maybe mute your audio just so we can quickly just do this here? So yes, so this right here, if we zoom in, is South Africa, okay? And so this becomes important. I'll show you different maps as it pertains to the distribution of different nations. Some of you will call them ethnic groups, derogatorily called tribes, and just distributions across South Africa, which does matter as it pertains to the provincial. Think of, in the U.S. context, state elections. Okay, so South Africa here, Cape Town is down here, right where the whites generally first began to colonize. Durban is here, more toward the Indian Ocean. Pretoria, sort of the one of the Boer capitals, if you will, here, and Johannesburg, where the gold mines are, the economic hub here. Okay, um, so essentially, and I'll try to and I'll stop sharing right now, and then we'll kind of resume real quick. So essentially, just to set things up, and then I'll jump back to some of these numbers. I'm going to start here just because we could start anywhere, but just in terms of time, we can't give you a whole history. But as we know, you have in 1988, there is a conflict in Angola between the Cuban soldiers and the MPLA. Parts of the ANC, SWAPO is there, but predominantly is the MPLA, and it is the Cuban soldiers who fight a combined force of the White South African Defense Force with UNITA, which was their local African proxy that did have popular support briefly in the southern parts of Angola, near where my ethnic group is in the north. And there was a big battle. It was called Quito Carnival, 1988. It's important because each side sort of claimed a victory slash on their end draw. But for us, since we are on the black side, we say it was a victory. And the victory, why? Because it forced, right, them to adopt resolutions that were held up in the UN around popular elections in Namibia, right? Essentially to allow free and fair elections in Namibia to take place, right? Because the South Africans were worried if SWAPO wins, right, then you have the front lines move of South Africa from the Angolan border all the way down right up to their border in South Africa, right? Given the alliance of SWAPO with the MPLA. This is important because now when 1990 hits and free and fair elections come in Namibia in exchange for the Cuban soldiers withdrawing, and the USSR, as we know, with perestroika and these different things with Gorbachev, was already sort of making its rightward turn. And so it did cause a bunch of disruptions. You know about the wall falling, etc. So SWAPO wins the elections in 1990. However, 10 years previously, Zimbabwe had come to power. And this is important to understand because this was the grassroots foundation that the colonists used to control the independence of the radical movements which they knew were coming to power. They knew we were going to come to political power easily by the late 1960s. It was just a matter of time. Right? The question was not about winning an immediate struggle that year. It was winning the struggle in 50 years. Right? They're thinking about some of the fights and the battles was not about winning this thing right now. It was about setting the conditions for the future. And so what happened in Zimbabwe is the surprise win of the ZANU PF, right, with 65 out of 80 seats in the initial National Assembly, freaked out the whites, essentially. Right? And they had controls built into the constitutions saying you could not change the constitution outside of a 2/3 or 3/4 majority of the parliament and after 10 years. Why? Because of the land question. Because they did not want white settlers to get kicked out of land, which is exactly what we were going to do. Right? And that was important, though, because those 10 years, which was agreed to by ZANU, they did. Even though Mugabe kicked and screamed, he didn't want to do it. And it's not about a defense of Mugabe right now. It's just fact. He didn't want to do it because he realized it would be a hard sell with people in the camps. Right? This is what ends up happening. Fast forward to Namibia. They also forced ZANU to be in a government of national unity with the white minority party. And they were given, the white minority party was given an inflated number of seats in parliament in order to control particular kinds of things happening in the transition. Okay? Ghana would go through something sort of similar-ish in the 50s, right? And so Namibia has elections, SWAPO wins the election, but it is not a full, if you will, election win because the whites are also in a coalition government with us, at least for the first 5 years. The same things happen with ANC when they come to power in 1994. They are forced into a government of national unity, essentially with the Boers who they were fighting just now. That's why, if you remember, it was Mandela and de Klerk who get the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993/94. I'm off a year somewhere there, right? In order to kind of show this government of national unity. This is very important. This is important because after the first elections went through, those controls to have an inflated white white representation, it went away. So in Namibia, for example, SWAPO was able to win 2/3 of the vote in the next elections, right? And even, however, the land redistribution question did not happen, and we'll talk about that in the next hour with Armando, right? But in the South African sense, right, Phurah will talk more about this than me. There were still some controls over what you could do in some of the constitutional agreements in the early 1990s around what laws you could change and not change, right? And we can talk about that, right? So I want to give you that context because you can imagine now part of what the whites also wanted to do in South Africa was to push this multi-party democracy, to try to hit at that 2/3 majority. You understand? To split the black opinion and to push and to back groups like the IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party, right? To push other groups like some of the so-called colored people's movements, to rebrand some of the old white supremacist parties as now dispassionate, non-racialist, Catholic, dispassionate, rational, capitalist accumulators, right? So the DA will try to say that right now about themselves, and then to now contest and control the revolutionary governments, or at least the leftist progressive agendas that the ANC SWAPO did have when they came into power, and I'll put ZANU in that too, again, with contradictions rife throughout. So with that being said, South Africa, what happened? Since Zuma was elected in 2014 as president. My number is going to be slightly off, so slightly off, but essentially the ANC had about 63, 64% of the vote, essentially in 2014. As many of you know, there was the internal splits were right within the ANC, and we can talk about some of those disagreements. And essentially, when he gets expelled, right, there is this move that moves with him out the party that we begin to see. And some people believed it would go to Malema. It did not, actually. It went to Zuma, which, if you know previously, they had split themselves around Mbeki. And that's also another thing that we can talk about at a little different, although because it does matter, right? And so essentially what ends up happening is that the ANC went from 65, 64% of the vote that they got, right, in 2014 to this past election, 40.8%. That is a 24% drop in the vote. MK party, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the party of Zuma, got about 15% of the vote. The DA, right? I'm going to start sharing my screen now so we can just now show some of these things right now so you can see. And again, people have contested some of these things. I mean, you know how these things go. So I don't want to sit here and see these Wikipedia numbers here like super accurate, right? But I just wanted to give y'all just a sense. Here's the National Assembly, right? So think of it in the US context, you know, Congress, right? Whoever has the majority, you can push your stuff through. If you have a 2/3 majority, you don't need particular debates and stuff. You can push things through. So the African National Congress got 40.2% of the vote, down from 64%. The Democratic Alliance, and I'm sorry, I'll say, why am I apologizing? These racist crackers, this is what we call them. I have no compunction. They here get 21% of the vote. Umkhonto we Sizwe gets about 14.6%. EFF gets 9.5%, which stayed stable. This number did not grow from their last few elections, which I think was a loss in many ways. Inkatha Freedom Party, 3.8%. And then different parties, these things do matter though, these different parties here get different percentages. The key is here, here, and here, right? This is very key here. And so because of this, the ANC did not have the 50% it needed to push, to basically to form a government, essentially, to form a government, right? To be able to push things through. If you look at France right now, some of you, right? France right now is hung because they basically have a three-way tie in parliament between the right wing, the moderates, and the left wing coalition, right? And so because the ANC doesn't have the 50%, they needed to enter in coalitions to get above 50%. But as you guys know, coalition is, well, what you gonna give me? Since you need me, and since you have been in power since 1994, right? So this essentially pushes them, what we thought, to an open alliance you could make with the EFF, Umkhonto we Sizwe, and some of the progressive black forces. That isn't what the ANC chose to do. They essentially did make an alliance with the DA to get themselves over even the 60% threshold. And this is where now I'll kick it to Phurah. And Phurah, if there's any other details about the national election that you want to give, some context, that you may want to give to this. That went a little bit longer than I wanted, but I did think some of the details have to be given. And I just want to push to Phurah, anything else from the national, or if you want to jump into the provincial elections, please do. But maybe to give just some details, bread and butter of that national story of the election results that I sketched. And then, yeah.
It's crazy what you just mentioned there about the EFF. The EFF, the Economic Liberation, the Julius Malema's party, actually, the previous elections, they had more than 10%. Of course, we can debate about the numbers, but they had more than 10% of the of votes, you know. And then the 2014 elections, they had actually 9.52%. So they declined. And they declined, and Julius is furious about this. You know, everyone is leaving his party, and the biggest winner in last year's elections, actually, even if this party did not manage to, to be in government, is Umkhonto we Sizwe with its 14.58%. This is unheard of, you know. And currently, Umkhonto we Sizwe sits as the opposition party in parliament. The DA, because the DA, they joined this thing that is called GNU, Government of National Unity. So Umkhonto we Sizwe, then it makes them the opposition party, and then of course EFF loses its EFF remains EFF is number 4 right now, you know. It's no longer number 3, you know. And of course, the biggest losers actually in all of this, Toivo, Natasha, is actually the black majorities, black people, the landless people of South Africa. This is the biggest loser. These people are the biggest loser because in South Africa we had a man, we call him an activist capitalist, a settler named by his name is Rob Hassoff. You must check this. His name is Rob Hassoff. Rob Hassoff, we call him the mastermind of coalition politics in South Africa. Now, what does this mean? This man he has put money, a lot of money, you know, together to repeat what I call the 1994 uh, failed attempt for black unity, or for black political parties, movements, and the leaders to actually have one voice, which Zuma, before they remove him from the seat, he, as a sitting president, was calling for all black uh, parties in parliament to unite, and also the kings to support the call for expropriation of land without compensation. So you can see that the biggest people who the biggest failures in the 2024 elections were black people, because GNU does not come with expropriation of land without compensation. GNU comes with, you know, just as happened in 1994, GNU comes with this position to reposition now white leaders, you know, settler leaders in position of power. No longer now, these guys are going to have what we call Toivo, the managers of white monopoly capital, but the capital, hence Rob becomes an activist capitalist. The capitalist, or the activists who are white and right wing in South Africa, they no longer need the likes of Muslim miners. They no longer need the likes of the so-called people like Gachabuteles, but they are actually taking power hands on. I mean, if you were to ask me right now, Steenhuisen is a minister. Steenhuisen is a settler from the Democratic Alliance, the DA. You even have, this is unheard of, post 94. You have another man called Groenewold. Groenewold is part of a political party called the Freedom Front Plus. Freedom Front Plus, if you read about South African history, you'll know that uh, they are the part, all of them were part of the nationalist party, which the apartheid regime, you know. And the ANC has given, because of the coalition, has given these guys power to rule us again. So you can see that if ANC, EFF, Umkhonto we Sizwe, and the disgruntled PAC come together, then you would have a different total picture. I would even call it that post 94, we failed a moment that would have taken at least um, our call, especially the expropriation of land with compensation, economic uh, power, as well as free education. You know, can take in place, as
Absolutely.
well as free education.
Yeah.
These parties are parties that would have pushed this
Yes.
question. You know?
Yes.
So,
So,
so
real quick, Puda, if you will, I think we're getting to analysis, and I just want to pay attention to time. If you mind, can I ask a more of a question, just so you can give some details for our audience a little bit?
yeah, yeah.
Yes. So, real quick, what I wanted to also push through is to look at, in another map that I have, is the distribution of the votes across the country. So, Umkhonto we Sizwe, part of what made MKP win such a large amount was that they really cleaned house in KZN. KwaZulu-Natal province, and in certain areas of the country. And this is important because it shows some of the divisions within the ANC traditionally, but even within some of the, in terms of areas of support. Like the ANC, for example, in Eastern Cape carried it, right? And even I think in Mpumalanga, I think MKP did well as well. In some of these areas. Maybe if you could speak a little bit to the distribution of these, say, ANC, DA, EFF, and MKP, sort of what areas in South Africa are sort of their areas of support. And if you want to talk about the provincial elections as well, and then we'll have our break to transition to analysis. And Armando will come on and join us, and then we can just have more of a free-flowing conversation on analysis.
Okay, I will start with the ANC. Of course, ANC got the most votes from Limpopo, Polokwane, Northern Cape, um, Limpopo, Northern Cape. We have 9 provinces, you know this. So Limpopo, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, and Free State. You know, so it is big, much more bigger in such provinces, including KZN. But KZN, of course, they lost because there's a reason why they lost. And then you have the DA. The DA is big in Pretoria as well as the Western Cape. The Western Cape has been big since the takeover from the ANC, 10 years ago. And then you have the MK Party, which is much more bigger in the in KZN. Of course, people are going to use this rhetoric that yeah, MK is a tribalist, a regionalist movement because its leader is Zulu, which is also just stereotypes, anti-black stereotypes. And then you have the EFF. You know, the EFF gets its votes from mostly in Johannesburg, in Johannesburg, Gauteng region, Gauteng region, as well as you might find that they also get in Mpumalanga as well. But this is how they then eat from the pie, and then, of course, you have these other, which we're going to go deeper when we go into analysis. These other small parties like Mosi Maimana's party, which is also getting some votes in Gauteng, because Gauteng is really a contested region. And Action SA, yes, it's called Action SA as well. They get some votes in Gauteng. So all these other small parties really they contest around Gauteng. But as I said, ANC almost all provinces, but they failed in KZN as well as in Mpumalanga. DA, Western Cape, this we know. EFF in Gauteng, they are really big in Gauteng. Mpumalanga, Northwest as well. And then who else did not count? Of course, these other ones, your UTM, which is Bandulo, Mrs. Party, you find it in the Eastern Cape. Yeah. And these other ones, they all actually Gauteng for me is the contested region in South Africa.
Yeah. So just for context, I'm gonna try to share my screen again, see if I can do this right. Gauteng, think of that as like your New York City area. It's where the let me zoom in. It's where it's it's where the gold mines, we're at. You know what I mean? It's like the big urban area, right? The big urban area is this Gauteng area over here, right? Johannesburg. So you can imagine that it's like heavy stakes for that area, right? Okay. So maybe what I'll ask. Yes. Okay, Frank, we're gonna answer that question in the next session with analysis because it's part of why I wanted to do this because again, there's a certain we'll answer that in the next section. So
And
maybe just for the yes,
really
please, Natasha.
before I vote, I wanted to ask, and I'm thinking that in terms of breaking things down, what might also be helpful is if you could just of the different provinces and the different places that you were mentioning, can you mention a little bit about like economically what those places look like just to give people an idea?
Yes, real quick. I'll jump in and put a jump in real quick. So Western Cape, if you will, Cape Town, think of it as San Francisco. It's got the wineries, it's got the tourism, right? It's essentially Europe in Africa. It's how they want it. They have historically controlled the black, darker skinned population coming in there. And I would say it was that Phurah grew up there, so he'll give you a better analysis. But think shipping, some of the ports, right? If you think of Eastern Cape, rural agriculture, cattle historically, right? Areas, right? If you think of Gauteng, which is Johannesburg. This is the city. This is New York City. This is the gold mines. This is some of the diamond mines, right? Although diamond mines are more in Kimberley and some of these areas further west, right? If you think KwaZulu-Natal, this is the traditional Zulu homeland, if you will. And this is where you have Durban, which I would say is the second port in South Africa, probably, but the main port going to the Indian Ocean, if you think about it, right? It's a warm water port, right? If you will, it's sort of where the blacks can go to for have a holiday on the beach if you ain't near the water, right? Because then Western Cape beaches is far if you in the east part of the country. And then that's what will give us the broad area of it. So Gauteng, you can imagine in terms of population, just numbers, Gauteng is the dominant one in terms of the just numbers there, and then KwaZulu-Natal, right? In terms of just numbers of people. It's why when you win there, you can win in a lot of different places. Like imagine comparing, say, the population of California with, say, Wyoming, right? So if you, it does. So Phurah, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, you said the you said a mouthful. Of course, Johannesburg and Natasha is exactly how he describes it, you know, and also with labor, concentrated labor, because our fathers used to, because I'm from the Eastern Cape actually, so they used to move from the rural areas, which is the Eastern Cape, to Johannesburg to find better living, you know, and of course Cape Town, I mean, traditionally we call it an island, a province of Europe in Africa. You can imagine by that, you know, and then Northern Cape. This is where Toivo there's a lot of mineral resources such as gold and stuff, and then Northwest is also, but Northwest because you have Northwest is there's a lot of we call it the Phurah in Namibia. I'm sure you relate. There's a lot of Phurahs in that province, and it's one of for me the most racist provinces in South Africa. So you can imagine how black people and there most work you find is blacks who work in the farms, you know, and then you have Limpopo. Limpopo is close to Zimbabwe, so there's not a lot of settlers there, but of course they exist everywhere. And black people, even today, they have a little bit of control of that province in terms of farming, you know, and then KZN as Toivo has mentioned, is also for me very contested. Toivo, I mean, the Indian community has businesses there, and black people are always pushed back, you know, and which other province Toivo that is big? I'm forgetting. You know? So, um, which other? Pretoria is part
Yeah.
of
Hmm.
Gauteng. So I won't
Yes.
mention Pretoria, you know. But
Yeah.
Pretoria, that's where Natasha, there's the Union building is in
Yeah.
Pretoria, and most government institutions are in Pretoria. But
Yeah.
Cape Town, Johannesburg, and KZN. These and maybe Eastern Cape because of Gqeberha, because of PE, you know. So these are the cities in South Africa that have more economic power, if I might argue. But
Yeah.
Gauteng is
Is the
is
key for it.
is
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
so-called economic hub,
Yeah.
so-called
Yeah.
economic hub.
Yeah. Yeah, for many people. Okay, so folks, we're gonna now transition. We're gonna have a little transition video right now, and then we're gonna move to analysis. We're already there. Again, we're running a little bit behind time. So thank you for being patient. We'll probably eat into a little bit of the 10 to 10:15 period to wrap up some of our conversations on occupied Azania, which you'll call South Africa. So we're going to jump to a transition video in about, say, 5 seconds, and then we'll come back and we'll have some deeper analysis for y'all. Okay? Okay.
Most people, when we say Afro-American, they think only of the Negroes in the United States. But they don't realize that 2/3 of Brazil consists of people of African blood, which means they're also Afro-American because Brazil is in South America. And in all of these, many of these countries in South America and Central America, and even in Canada, they are heavily populated with people whose ancestors came from Africa. So when you total up the number of Afro-Americans, real Afro-Americans, in the Western Hemisphere, there are perhaps 100 million. And if these people ever unite among themselves, not only is it necessary for the Afro-Americans in the United States to be organized, but it's also necessary for the Afro-Americans in the Caribbean, or the Afro-Cubans, the Afro-Brazilians. It's necessary for all of them to be organized. And then once they are organized in each place, we have to organize among ourselves so that the Afro-American in the United States will be working in conjunction in a coordinated program with those who are in Cuba, and those in Brazil, and those in Venezuela, and those throughout the Caribbean, and Haiti, and in the West Indian Islands. And in this way, we actually get strength. And it's not an accident that there's no organization existing in the Western Hemisphere that's designed toward that end. It would be it would be a direct threat to imperialism as it really exists, and to colonialism as it exists in the West. And one of the things that's going to help to bring this about is the independence of Africa. And one of the only reasons that we in the West have never organized, we have hated our image and our African image. And because Africa has been in the hands of people who have created an image of Africa that's negative and hateful. And it has been hateful to us. We haven't wanted to identify with it. But now that Africa is getting independent and in a position to create its own image, and it's a positive image, those of us in the West look at the African image and see how positive it is, and we begin to identify with it. We become proud of Africa, and we become proud of our African blood, our African heritage. And this is what is beginning to make the Africans in the Western Hemisphere today develop more race pride. And as this race pride develops, then it has a tendency to make us want to unite together and work together. And your Western imperialists and colonialists consider this to be a grave threat. More threat than communism or Marxism or socialism or anything else. The Africanism is what they consider to be the real threat.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was so inspirational, actually, Malcolm, to my book and to my thinking. And again, for those of you who are not as aware, Malcolm's speeches were very widely recorded. Sorry, his recordings were very widely spread in occupied Azania and in Namibia. Right? It was illegal. It was banned to actually have some of these things, but people found ways to listen to him and Dr. King and some others. But really, in some of even the early publications of the Pan-Africanist Congress and even the non-European unity movement, many of them quote Malcolm X from the late 1950s, early 60s. So again, that global reach is heavy. So, okay. So it's about 9:43 a.m. US Eastern Standard Time. Just given some of the time things and given just where we kind of went, we kind of wanted to lay out some things for you in that first half over there. So we're going to try to have about maybe 20-25 minutes for this section next. It might push to 30 and then we'll transition to Namibia. Phurah, I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'm going to time it, and I'm just going to give you like a count from 1 minute left, 3 minutes left, etc. Just in your sense, speaking to a global, Black audience, for audiences, in the Black America, Black people who are curious about the continent, who want to engage with the continent beyond just Africa for the Africans. They want to get deeper into the details to understand some of what's going on and to kind of ask the right questions. It's not saying we have all the answers, but to ask the right questions. But just from your perspective, what are the implications of this election? Just what are some things we should be looking at? Why did the ANC get into this alliance with the DA? I hear a lot. People are like, why would they do that, right? Why didn't they get into alliance with MKP, right? Why didn't the EFF do more? We heard Frank's question there. Frank's like, well, how is it that the DA is able to get more numbers of votes than the EFF? Where how is this possible, right? And some of us have answers to that actually. What does that mean, right? But just what are some of the implications, thoughts, lessons of this election that you'd like? And I'll come back to you, but just maybe 10 minutes and like maybe 10, 12 minutes of some thinking on that, and then I'll jump in and then we'll see if we can have some engagement, okay?
Yeah, I mean, the question you're asking me, I want to use for this, I want to use Rob Hassoff as my point of analysis and how he envisions South Africa, which the 2024 vision hinges on fragmentation, and this man is a man who supports and funds a range of political parties in South Africa, including I had to talking about Action SA, Muslim Maiman, and right-wing social movements like the so-called Operation Dudula. So these formations, um, they really form, or else under his influence, I argue, is to adopt an anti-immigrant, first of all, rhetoric, you know, which distracts us from the real issues. If you remember, um, the so-called Amakorekwere Nakahambe, in South Africa. And so, so now this man, he understood that the black psyche and skillfully exploits its um, uh, and he skillfully exploits the black sides, which I argue that the ANC, there is no way that ANC would have worked or is going to work with the EFF as well as the Mkondo Caesar, because you must remember that um, there was a time when Thabo Mbeki actually wrote a huge, um, he had like 3 pages or something critiquing Jacob Zuma, that no, Jacob Zuma, he's wrong to say that uh, ANC wants expropriation expropriation of land without compensation, because that's not ANC's culture, and ANC does not want expropriation of land without compensation. ANC is a rainbow nation, movement, you know. So you can see there that for ANC to have a real meaningful for themselves coalition, it is okay with the DA, because the ANC of Ramaphosa actually is a proper manager, or is a movement that manages DA's aspirations or policies with, I mean, if you look at the GNU, so the 2024 elections really, for me, if people are not, if you're really reading through into the politics of South Africa, you'd see that what Rob herself said, the activist capitalist said before 2024, and his vision is actually happening in South Africa today through the GNU, um, which of course annihilates the black movement or the black agenda, which is the colonial Caesar, as well as um, EFF. Also, Toivo, the 2024 elections for me really look at the PAC. Where is PAC? PAC is part of GNU, Government of National Unity, which is led actually by the DA. So you can see that the repetition of
Can you tell people,
Kushnan
sorry, Phurah, who is the PAC?
Oh, PAC is so funny. PAC is called Pan-African. PAC is a Pan-Africanist movement, or Pan-Africanist Congress, which was founded by the great leaders such as Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, and the Babumda was there. It's a breakaway from the ANC. I mean, one of their critiques in the 50s was the Freedom Charter, which Freedom Charter says that the land belongs to all who live in it, black, white, and other nationalities within the country. And these guys, they actually rejected this idea. And the Robert Sobukwe and his comrades, in I believe that in the 2024 elections, they would not have um, joined with the DA, with the DA to form GNU. So the Pan Africanist, PAC today, Toivo, is just like the South African Communist Party. There's nothing, for me, as I argue, there's nothing Pan-Africanist about PAC, which is led by Mzanele Nyonzo, you know, same as the SSCP. But they really posture as Pan-Africanist in South Africa. So, anyways, so you have a black bloc, which is so-called PAC, which is a Pan-Africanist movement, joining the GNU, and then you have EFF as well as Mkondo Wesizwe, which which Mkondo Wesizwe rejects the question of joining GNU, because GNU in its essence, GNU rejects the question of expropriation of land without compensation. GNU is just the national government of unity which Nelson Mandela took over in 1994. There's no differences in this, you know, and anything that got to do with the black agenda must be rejected. This is one of their projects, really. But then you have the EFF, which today at some point, I'm not sure if you've been following, they are rejecting Umkhonto weSizwe, and they have their own reasons why they reject Umkhonto weSizwe, you know, which also continues again because of Rob Hessoff's idea of 2024 elections, that it's really must divide the black vote. So Julius Malema and Mkono Wesizwe continue also to play into this theater of the black vote, that it must be fragmented, you know. So for me, if you really want to understand, right, the 2024 elections and the vision of 2024, you must read or you must follow this white capitalist called Rob Hessoff, which they really spend a lot of money to make sure that, because remember in 2024 we had a lot of movements out of nowhere led by Musi Maimane, the Action SA, for no reason, all for to continue to divide the black vote, which as I argue, they managed to do so, you know. So this is my point, man. Really, before I allow you in, is skillfully how white monopoly capital in Stellenbosch use money to continue to create this division among the black vote. And they did, and they've done this. And we are sitting here today with the ANC. I mean, ANC lost elections. I don't know why people think that ANC won elections. ANC lost elections. They were 40%, which I argue that in
Yeah, I
2026
agree.
we are going to go beyond 40%. So
Yep,
as
you're
as
correct.
the clip we're watching on Malcolm X, you can see, man, what also Malcolm X saw before, that one of, and it tires me. It really makes me tired how no one sees this. That no, man, what capital does in the black world really is to continue to divide. You see that division, you know, that breaking the that um, dividing of black movements, black leaders continues even post in South Africa, even post 1994. I mean, you can't tell me why EFF, PHC, and as well as MK can work together even today. Besides mentioning Toivo, besides putting in the ANC, because we know now me and you, we know the ANC is compromised, ANC is sold out, ANC is a sell-out project. But these three movements, and the biggest disappointment is PAC having to join this so-called GNU government of national unity. Government of national unity, people who do not know, is a formation of um, because ANC has 40%, and ANC says, we can't govern with 40%. Of course, we can't. You need to have at least 60% to govern, or at least you need to have maybe 51% to govern, like ANC governed before. Then they brought in the TA, they brought in UTM, they brought in this racist movement called it's not Afro Forum, but it's a sister of Afro Forum.
Freedom Front Plus.
Freedom Front Plus, as well as our brothers and sisters, PAC, and others in that coalition, So you can see that the ANC, people will still think that maybe the ANC has something to give. No, it does not have something to give right now, the ANC. And partially, because these people, they have been introduced to capital Toivo, there is no way that the ANC was going to work with a Umkondo Sizwe, or there's no way they were going to work with EFF, because given they really do not want to lose the blue lights, as we might say,
Yeah.
They don't want to lose the blue lights. I mean, the blue lights, which is, people don't know that, the ministerial books, to be a minister, and all these things.
Yeah.
But what is crucial is for people who are not in South Africa or do not follow South African politics to follow. There's a man called Rob Hassoff.
Yes.
Rob Hassoff, just like this other man who passed away from England, Lord Renwick, did in Zimbabwe, because if you remember, Lord Renwick convinced Nelson Mandela in 1994 not to go with expropriation of land with that conversation. He said, this is a stupid idea. Don't take this. So
and in ways, that right there was to counter Winnie Mandela, because Winnie Madikizela Mandela was saying we need to now do the land thing. It's why that divorce happens. It is more political than necessarily personal, even though, of course, we know these things are linked. That is very important, because when Mandela came out of prison in 1990, he was talking about nationalizing the economy in particular ways, and he was more open, although I don't think adamant, but he was more open to a more progressive land redistribution policy.
Yeah, especially Nelson Mandela in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken. You can see Nelson Mandela really was a radical man, and we can't blame Nelson Mandela really. I mean, for all the failures of South Africa, but you can see the man was really a revolutionary man.
Got you.
But post 94, Rob Hassoff is the man that we must focus on, and is the man who really had a mastermind of the GNU politics.
No, thank you so much. Natasha, please.
Yeah, Phurah, would you say that in all that you've laid out in terms of talking about the way in which Rob Hassoff has, in particularly using his economic position to help divide these different Black political parties, African political parties, and the movement of some of them into what's called the JNU, that at the one hand you're seeing a division of these parties, and saying how there's a division and these groups are not willing to work together, but also that at the same time it's also kind of looking like they're willing to come together underneath a different type of formation that is not really, so that at the same time that there is a disunity in a sense amongst these different political parties, that in a sense that there's a unity under this economic form, so that there is, I guess, maybe a possibility that it just shows that they can, but they're doing it in a way that is counterproductive to their own interests.
If I can say a few things, Phurah, maybe answer briefly, and I do have a few things I want to say just to sort of stitch some of these things together, and I do have a thought on the AFF and stuff, and so please answer, Phurah, and then I'll say a few things myself, and then we can wrap up this section and begin to move to the next one. But I'll give you the final word, Phurah, and then again, Natasha, some final thoughts from you as well. So please, Phurah, if you want to answer that, and then I'll say a few things also.
Yeah, of course, Natasha. Here's the thing. I remember there's a joke in the movement we used to make. Apparently, there's a guy called Hlaudi Motsoeneng. Hlaudi Motsoeneng was COO if I'm not mistaken, of SABC, a national broadcaster in South Africa. So they were called into a meeting, black leaders into a meetings, and but the first thing he asked in that meeting, Claudio has his own political party. He asked before the meeting. He said, "Before the meeting starts, leaders, I want to be the president of whatever we are going to come up with here." So immediately after he said that, the meeting collapsed, Natasha. You see, to show that all of these leaders, there's no one wants to be led. This is another thing that actually is killing black formations. That we always ask Natasha, if the three of us are going to be in a movement, I'm not going to be led by Toifa, and I'm not going to be led by Natasha. I want to lead this group. And then this is one of the biggest problems we have in South African politics, really, especially because there is, I just forgot the name of it, there is a so-called in parliament today coalition between the EFF, Condoleezza Caesar, and two or three other black movements in parliament. But it's not going to go anywhere because the question all movements have is who is going to lead this united front? And no one wants to answer this question because everybody wants to lead this united front. I'm just want to say that even if you can see that there's a um, um, flirting of this idea of a united front, but still, I mean, best example with Face Must Fall, Rose Must Fall. One of other reasons that in a way destroyed the movement was this question of leadership. Out of nowhere, there was just a lot of other problems we had within, which really killed the movement. So for me, the biggest problem in Africa, in fact, is always the question of who is going to lead this united front that we, even if we flirt around it, Natasha, but it's not going to go forward up until this question of leadership of whatever we envision, whatever movement we see. This question can be answered, then I think we can move forward. Of course, capital is going to play its role in destroying whatever that we want to do. But also among ourselves, we don't trust each other. So these things are going to fail.
Absolutely. No, thank you. So I'm going to let me see. I'm going to say a few things. I'm going to give myself a timer. Except, yeah, there we go. Okay, I got the number that I wanted. Okay, cool. So let me give myself a little timer, and I want to say a few things. Frank, a little bit to some of your questions, and then also to others who I think have jumped in some things. Someone talked about the PAC, et cetera, over there, and I'll see if I can try to answer some of this stuff. Okay, so I'm
Yeah,
gonna give myself about
sorry,
5 minutes.
Also, I wanted to know what was that question about the PAC? It
Yeah,
just came.
yeah, no, it's just I think someone was just more saying, not a question, just a declaration. They think the PAC is still relevant, because they believe they're still relevant because of their vision. And this is what you will find here in on this U.S. side, I think, or people who have certain connections, is that the ideological significance of the PAC, I think, is very strong, right? Particularly in the diaspora, but that's a position there, right? So, well, I'll answer that. I'm sure you have some answers too, Phurah, but let me try it right now. So, okay. So, on the one thing in terms of some of the things to think about, and I'll start with Malema. I'll start with Malema mostly because on this side in the US, particularly in the Black progressive circles, I do think people have been zooming in on Malema as someone who sounds good. He's saying all the things we want to hear. And that is the man's genius. The man's charismatic. He's a very good organizer. He knows exactly what you want to hear, and he will say what you want to hear to get you to do some of the things he believes needs to be done, right? What's important about Malema is that Malema does believe in the Freedom Charter. He's a charterist. He never actually broke from the Freedom Charter. And for some of us who broke from the cheap Freedom Charter, and I write about this in my book, and other people long before me have written about it, right? I mean, part of Sobukwe's break, let's just bring the PAC in right now. Because in this 1950s moment, the PAC or what would become the PAC, as well as the non-European unity movement, would be the more radical movements to the ANC. But essentially, the Freedom Charter, this compiled document from dubious sources that people believe is this national document somehow done when Black people are under occupation, essentially one of the things it says, in a generally broadly socialistic, if you will, progressive document, the land belongs to all who live on it, both white and Black, both Black and white. So us in the Pan-Africanist, in the Azaniist movement, we will always reject that. There will be no white land ownership claims anywhere in Africa. But this is important because the ANC from that point signaled they would be willing to do it. And the communists at the time were right behind them. And many believe were central to the putting of that provision in the Freedom Charter as a way to force a split in the ANC with many of the Black nationalist forces that were within the ANC. Because as many of you folks know, at one point in time, and many points in time, right, many of us are in multiple formations at the same time, right? Garveyism had a legacy in South Africa. You had people who were Garveyites, who were ICU, and ANC, right? Or people who had their local ties to their village politics, but then also ANC or whatever. So you have multiple tendencies in these movements, right? And so what we begin to see is that in 1954, 55, already the ANC is signaling the land belongs to all who live on it, Black and white, which means they will always be open to working with whites in a unity government. And so with that being the case, that never changed. Right. And this is where sometimes in diaspora, I will say we got to pay attention to who we be supporting and not just to support somebody because we like what they say. Same thing with us on the continent. Just because we like what certain people be saying on the Black American side, don't mean we just should be supporting if we don't have some of the deeper looking into what's happening on the ground. So let's now fast forward. Right. The ANC, right, never deep down believed the armed struggle would overthrow apartheid. They never believed necessarily that they were going to expel the whites and kick them out and take the land for the masses. What they did believe was trying to move in some of their own, let's just say some of their own radical non-Black nationalist formations, that we could see state power a la Lenin, state and revolution, and then begin to redistribute power from that basis. If you read straight State and Revolution, kind of Lenin lays out his thing. The problem with even that is that if you were talking about a white settler colony, and if you're talking about the state must be an oppressive arm of the working class against the bourgeoisie, and the working classes have always been Black, then you're going to have to come out against the white folk. And it's going to have to be a race understanding of the class question, which, of course, the ANC did not do. And many of us in the Black nationalist wing were kicked out of or chose not to get involved in these talks after 1988 to now lead up to the constitution that it got agreed upon, right? And so there are many scholars in the Black nationalist tradition in Azania, occupied Azania, who are critiquing the Constitution. The Constitution in South Africa, and Phurah can speak about this, is the highest law of the land, right? And it has not oh, absolutely, Vukoni, absolutely. Many of us can go deeper into, listen, our position in the Black nationalist position, right, is that colonialism has begun since 1652. From the beginning of the white presence in Azania, we have been under occupation and at war. All right. So elections is simply a recent manifestation of an engagement in bourgeois parliamentary politics. Okay. It is not necessarily some new particular thing, right? That's what the Bantustans were for, right? That was what some of the other divide and conquer things were, right? So us on the Azanian end, we're very, very clear, right? I do not see 1994 as freedom. I do not see 1905 or 08, whenever the British handed over the Republic to the Boers, as freedom. We have been fighting for our freedom since 1652. I do not celebrate South African Independence Day. I don't celebrate Namibian Independence Day anymore either, because we still are fighting for our land and for the dispossession question. When we move to Malema, part of the problem that we must understand with Malema and his split from Zuma, in broad strokes, and Phurah will have his own thoughts and we can't get too deep, but in broad strokes, it was a disagreement around Mbeki. Mbeki, in some ways, was sort of trying to push, and I'm a little bit over my time, he sort of tried to push a certain type of an African philosopher king type of a persona, right? And sort of trying to see South Africa as this enlightened leader, right, of this new Africa, right, in this certain kind of a way, right? Very much an intellectual. He always was a man of ideas and thoughts, very much so. The Western tradition loves him in these ways, right? But that was critique because Mbeki was not always loved within the ANC. As you all know, in many of our movements, we talk about the multiple waves of the Black Panthers. They were split on many ends. You have your East Coast, West Coast, right? We have the SCLC itself also was split in many ways. NAACP, we have Robert Williams, right? And then we have some other cats, right? So these splits have always been there. Right. And so in some senses, Zuma began to manifest himself as a critique to some of what Mbeki was doing because they felt you a little bit too soft on these white folk and you ain't actually really down here grounded with the masses. Say what you want to say about Zuma. Zuma can move into the hood, into the township, and just chill and talk and just, you know, build with people. He was in Robben Island, you know, he was in the arm doing intelligence. He has that kind of move versus Mbeki is the enlightened philosopher king. You feel me? And Ramaphosa comes along. He's backed by these white capitalists who Phurah is talking about to buy the ANC election. They want to buy the ANC election because Zuma is pushing the ANC in South Africa more toward a BRICS direction, and a BRICS direction not to be necessarily anti-capitalist, but to have competition within capitalists and within capitalism and outcompete local white monopoly capital. That's where your Guptas and stuff comes from. And this is where I do have my critique of Malema in some ways. He did jump fully into that because he was pissed with Zuma in ways because he felt after I supported Zuma in your coup essentially against Mbeki, I should have gotten a higher position in government than what you gave me. That is essentially, in many regards, part of the critique, not all of it. I don't want to simplify it to that. But in many ways, it was that because, Malema, you were right behind Zuma in these critiques of Mbeki. Some of us don't forget that, right? And so when this happens, this pushes the split, and Phurah and others and Andile and others begin, and we can talk about that history there. But my issue with Malema and why he didn't get more votes than the DA is because the DA has control over the Western Cape. They have been able to utilize the race question and the colorism question with the quote-unquote so-called colored, so-called mixed race peoples, if you will, in predominantly the western part of South Africa, the Western Cape. And DA has been able to bring that large percentage of folks to them, and being able through strict immigration policies to keep the darker skinned Black peoples out of Western Cape, to keep the numbers in ways where they can win some of these elections. Right? Cape Town, if you go there, it's a violent place for Black people. It is not a Black liberatory space. This is a European city, for those of you who have been there. Right? Me and Phurah were there years ago trying to mobilize when they began criminalizing homeless and all these different sorts of things, right? The parliament is right there. And that white bastard is still on his horse in front of the South African parliament, welcoming you to the gates. Right? So this is very important to understand about some of these things. And so DA was able to get that portion. And surprisingly, Phurah in Eastern Cape, DA has a good 15-20% support there as well, because many white settlers were in these areas, in the urban areas as well. And part of how DA has rebranded itself is to a rising African petty bourgeoisie, sort of saying we aren't as corrupt as the ANC. We are more efficient in running capitalism. We are more efficient in service delivery. We are more efficient in some of these things that you are working hard for, unlike these old comrades and these old tates who are taking all these positions with no education just because they were in the bush and they struggled back in the day. Right? And so they have been able to capture a number of folks, right, in some of these ways, right? And then, of course, play on some of the splits that they had set up from previously. So I'm going to end it there, mostly to say that part of what Malema failed, in my opinion, is I think he sloganeered too much. The reality is that right now, South Africans, like everybody else in the world, we are struggling with bread and butter issues. I can't eat the Haitian flag for dinner. As much as I love Haiti, the Black nationalist flag, I love listening to Malcolm X, I love all these things right here. I cannot, the water is dirty. We're having gang violence. We're having violence in some of the townships that you know is just created by colonialism. But you know, people, when you in that hood, you ain't running around talking about, well, colonialism is making me want to fight the guy across the street. Nah, you starving, my G, and you out here fighting. And they play on some of the ethnic tensions and stuff to do some of these things, right? And so it's important to understand at that level, are you speaking to them or are you just sloganeering? For some of us in the Western Hemisphere, particularly Black folk, we hear part of what they say, part of what they say in South Africa, and it feels so great because we don't have the freedom to say some of those things in a black space as they do there, particularly, for example, around Palestine. People, when the ANC made the challenge for Palestine in the World Court, that was one of the most passe and light things for them to do. They are absolutely in leagues with the Zionists back home, Ramaphosa and his people. The diamond mines, the De Beers, all these different things here of always the diamond polishing. Tel Aviv is one of the main places for diamond polishing in the world, and most of Namibia and South Africa's diamonds are going there. So what does it mean to now be challenging him in the international court? Right? So I think it's important that we sort of talk about that in terms of some of the implications of this. Also, the last thing I want to say is in terms of the number I wanted to pull up is in terms of electoral turnout. In 2004, it was 76%. 2009, it was 77%. In 2024, it was 58%. So again, a significant drop. Also, the youth vote. A lot of young people are not voting right now. This is a universal thing. I also would be remiss, and I have to bring this up right now, I think very important. Many of the young sisters in particular are not happy with MKP because they see Zuma as a rapist and a sexual assaulter. He absolutely did say some of those things, and he absolutely is culpable, in my opinion, for many of these accusations. And a lot of the younger population, particularly with the immense numbers of violence against women, gender-based violence, rape, and sexual assault in South Africa, him being a leader, doing some of the things that he has done, has not endeared him to a younger population, the queer communities, younger Black women, as well as a younger population in general. Right. And in Namibia, this will be important too when we jump to the next section, because that community, the younger LGBTQ and the young progressive feminist movement in Namibia and South Africa is strong, and in Namibia it is rising, and it is also pushing people to say, well, none of you guys are actually representing our interests, because either one of you that comes into power, our lives as queer folks, as women, as poor queer folks, are still not much to change. So I think that's also important to also see why there's also people who are not embracing MKP because of Zuma and some of what has happened there. Okay. So I said a lot there. I'm sorry. I just want to know, Natasha, if there's some things you wanted to say, and then I wanted to give Porter the last word for us as we transition to the next section. Again, we will talk about other things as well. I'm not sure if Armando is here. If not, I'm just going to say a little bit more in the Namibia section, etc. We might make it shorter if Armando is not here. But I wanted to ask Natasha, what are some things you'd like to say, some thoughts? And then Porter, if you want to close us out, and then we can transition to the next section.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, I guess a small question, and maybe when Phurah answers, I mean, says his last statements, maybe he might be able to answer this one particular question along with whatever else. Small thoughts that I have. I did, in terms of the anti-immigrant rhetoric, one of the things when I heard about that and thinking about this guy that we mentioned before, Rob Herzog, whatever his name is, but in particular, when we're talking about anti-immigrant sentiment, who are we considering, immigrants? Are we considering those who are immigrants, those that are coming from Africa, within Africa, or are we considering those who are within Africa going into South Africa, occupied Azania, the immigrants, and looking at those coming from Europe as as the ones who are not the immigrants? Like, who are we talking about? Because it also makes me think about some of the news that we've seen coming out of occupied Azania around, people who are coming from other places within Africa and that tension that exists there. We've seen in the news about, tensions between Nigerians who are, and South Africans and things like that, but also how at the same time you have this tension, nobody is, saying anything about the whites that are living there and that are absolutely not, indigenous to the land, that should not even be there, that, control most of it. And also thinking about the economics in terms of, if you have in South Africa, in occupied Azania, 80% at least, right? At least 81% of the population being African people, that you have the white political party getting 21% of the vote. People, especially us, here in the West, you're thinking in a country that is 81% Black, that we cannot get a majority vote. It cannot be a landslide where, of course, a Black person, is an African person is going to be the one who rules. So I think like that is also interesting for us to think about in terms of just the sheer number of people, and also knowing that that population, you know, of African people, the majority are also the ones that are mostly unemployed, that have the hardest time getting jobs, that have the hardest time maintaining themselves. So even with that, you still have this white political party getting 21% of the vote. And so I think that's very interesting. And I think that it also speaks to this idea, right, that the current elections and the move of the ANC and joining with this white political party speaks to this idea that Europeans have put forward, and that kind of is resonating in the turnout of this election, is that African people cannot govern themselves, that they must be there to govern, right? And that they're putting themselves in that position to say, look, we've given you, and I think I saw a quote that said that this white boy Rob Herzog said that you know, if Nelson Mandela was alive, he would vote for them too, because the ANC hasn't done anything, you know, for. And so again, this paternalistic language that's being put out there, but still, even with that, you still have the elections turning out the ways in which they did. And so, you know, along with that, and also thinking about expropriation of land, and this continue, and thinking about also to what role does that play, or the resistance to actually dealing with the land question? What does the possibility of sanctions on South Africa by the West play in the way in which different political parties view doing, you know, taking on this idea of expropriation of land, taking on the idea of, you know, taking land back from settlers? Because what we're talking about is land back, not land, as they would kind of phrase it, land theft. They committed land theft. This is not the same thing as, you know, committing land theft. When you get your land back is not the same thing as land theft, which we know is what the settlers did. So, I mean, just these are just some of my thoughts. I have more, but I won't go into it.
And I think blacks, they're just the same everywhere. I'm thinking about where you might be. I mean, in America, right? Remember that we can debate the other things about what I'm gonna say right now. Really, for Americans, Cornel West was, I'm not sure, but I know Cornel West was contesting, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Cornel West was contesting.
Yeah, he was trying to run. Yeah.
Yeah, he ran.
Yeah, he ran. Yeah. But check this. Do you know this? Even if I'm not sure about this, but I know that a lot of black people, either they voted for Trump or for the other lady.
Kamala,
Right?
yeah. Kamala Harris,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. So I always ask myself this question: why, when there is clearly a Cornel West, we know Cornel West. Leave that, oh, I have this politics and that politics against Cornel West, but Cornel West is black. Out of these three people, for me, Cornel West is black, proper black. But they decided to cast their vote for someone else who was not black. So for me, this is not just a South African phenomenon. It's the biggest problem we have as black people around the world. That, do you know, Toivo in the Eastern Cape DA is not voted by white people. It's voted by Xhosa people there, by black people, my tribe. You know, so it frustrates me, man. How because the thing is this also, that I believe that African people all over the world have a problem, and also with all these problems, Toivo, really, we have a lot of problems we have as black people, you know. The problems that some comrades might have with Jacob Zuma, that, yeah, Jacob Zuma, one, is a cishet man, I'm not going to vote for him, which makes sense, you know. Jacob Zuma is this and that, is closer to Gupta's. So you can see that there's no, for me, we still do not have a consensus as to say, who are we going to vote for as black people in South Africa, including, I mean, in Namibia, in America. black people, they make me tired, man. That we would rather Natasha would rather not vote for Toivo for all the problems Toivo has with you, but you end up voting for a Hillary Clinton because you have a problem with this blackface. So they brings me to South Africa, man. Again, look, when they say that the so-called in South Africa, Natasha, when they say the so-called foreigners must go, you must ask, who are these foreigners? Foreigners in black people's face is other black people. There's this leader called Gaten Mackenzie. Gaten Mackenzie goes as far as saying that how I'm going to identify a foreigner is through everyone in South Africa must carry a passport. Oh, sorry, must carry an ID. So if you do not have an ID, then you'll be classified as a person who must leave South Africa. But I have a major problem because you see how dark I am. In 2009 or 10, I was with a friend of mine. We were almost beaten up by our own people in South Africa because they thought we are from maybe Zimbabwe or something. So you can see that um, foreigners in South Africa, I am also included because how are you going to know if I'm Zimbabwean or not Zimbabwean? But the people we know that they are real foreigners in South Africa, even their skin color, we don't want to touch these people. In South Africa, each and every white person you see, we all think that they are South Africans and they belong here. And each and every black skin you see walking around in South Africa, we always have this question that, are you from Zimbabwe? Or are you from Nigeria? Or are you from Namibia? So you can see how colonialism have completely, man, conquered us to the point where, look, Julius Malema is for the borders to be open. But check this. Do you know one of, if I'm not mistaken, 12, one of Cecil John Rhodes' dream was to have a train that moved from Cape to Cairo to open the borders. So you see that also the rhetoric of open borders, we must also um, um, interrogate it as to what does it mean, because whites or capital in South Africa is for opening of borders because they want to exploit labor, because they know that South Africans are not going to work for 20 rands per hour, but another person from Zimbabwe might take 20 rands per hour. So the borders must be open. So now you are really left with a big problem because now me, I am for borders to be open, but the borders cannot be open until we know who is a foreigner and who is not a foreigner in Africa. Black South African people in South Africa, they, 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 they really do not know this question of who is a foreigner and who is not a foreigner. And me and you, we know that foreigners in Africa is those who came in Africa and colonized us. And we know who are these people, really. But we are not going to pinpoint them because uh, we, I think we just scared of Abelongo.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I think to be bluntly, we are scared of Abelongo really because
yeah,
even today you can see a black person. They even Julius Malema can be loud, but he's loud, but he does not want to be louder, man. He always wants to be. When he's with the three of us, he's going to say what we want to hear. When he
yeah,
gets out of this meeting, he's going to go to his white funders and
yeah.
dance to their tunes. So so these are the type of leaders we have today, which and which, if we are going to talk of a united front, uh, they are going to, because they don't want to piss off their masters, they're always going to ask the
Yeah,
question, who's going to lead? You know,
yeah, yeah,
so
yeah,
one, your question about who is a foreigner. For me, foreigner is the settlers who came in Africa and colonized us. That's it. An African person, I don't care where they're from, Haiti, they are from Brazil, they are from Australia. These are African people. They must have all rights I have. They must have the same rights I have in Africa. You understand? And they can move up and down. But this will not be the case if we still have um, leaders who, even today, like our leader Julius Malema, actually, who can give his votes to the Democratic Alliance, to the DA, because we know this Julius Malema in 20 in the local government elections.
Yeah, the local government account, and they did that. Yeah, they did.
Pretoria,
They did.
he gave his votes to the DA. You see. The
And
same
that
DA,
and no Pura, that was done quietly, right? So he's very loud with the other Pan-Africanism and the black nationalism,
but in the
everybody in
corner,
the diaspora, everybody loves Malema, but then in the local conciliatory thing, he quiet,
in the corner,
just
and
quiet.
also
And then
And also, we must finish this as well. The PAC, man. I want to go back to this. The Pan
yeah,
African
please. And maybe
Congress.
Pura close up with the PAC just because of time. We have to shift to
Yeah, I'm
Namibia.
gonna
So
close up
maybe close with the
on
PAC and
PAC.
then we'll transition, but we'll get back to these questions.
Post 94 PAC for me is playing the same game as the game the economic freedom fighters are playing. Look, there's proof. They are sleeping with the DA in backdoors through this thing called government of national unity. A government of national unity we are rejecting. But do you know that, sorry, do you know that Toivo, the president of PAC is actually, the president of PAC is the minister of land, the land department or
Yeah,
ministry.
useless ministry. And they
No,
gave
no, no,
him
no,
this.
no,
So
no, no, no. No, 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 it's not useless.
you don't think so?
Natasha, if I or Andile or MK Party were given, dude, if you, Toivo, we can give you in Namibia the ministerial of ministering land affairs, what would you do in the morning?
Well,
The
the thing
first
is, you
thing I
know what
would
I'll
do
do,
in the
but they'll
morning.
just fire me. They'll remove me. So I mean, I don't
That's
know.
this is the problem, Natasha, that they will remove me if I were to do what black people want. Hello, guys. They will remove you. Dude, it's not a job, that thing. You are elected there. If you want a job and you are scared to be removed, go put your CV in a job where you are going to be scared to be removed. But this one says, your policy says expropriate land without compensation. Me, I take the land today, I'll pass a law today that says, I know that I need the full state to support me, but I'll pass the law and say expropriation of land without compensation tonight must happen. And I know the people in the township will take the land. And then if they
Yes.
fire me, then I know that I use that as a consciousness raising tool, to gather support from my people to say that I am still with you. But if I'm not going to do that because I'm scared that I might get fired, then the PAC, it means that they are for them to contest for elections was actually for them submitting CVs, which
Yeah,
they should just go and look for a job. If they're scared, if they were to do this, then they'll be fired.
for
I think
sure.
I'm fine here, guys.
Yes. Okay, guys, thank you so much for that. That's the South Africa portion. And then now we'll transition. Natasha, I think you were gonna say a few things.
I just wanted to say thank you again, Puda, and also make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for being here. Stay tuned and keep watching.
Okay. Thank y'all. See you in a bit.
Changes which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by black people. And for black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was the psychological feeling of inferiority. So then in '68, we started forming what is now called SASO, the South African Students Organization, which was firmly based on black consciousness, the essence of which was for the black man to elevate his own position by positively looking at those value systems that make him distinctively a man in society. First of all, we said as black students, we could not participate in multiracial organizations, which were by far white organizations, because in this country there is an overwhelming number of white students at university. And secondly, these organizations were concentrating mainly on problems which were affecting the white student community, which meant that NUSAS as an organization gave political opinions which were largely affected by the whiteness of that particular organization.
Yep. Never
Hey,
know.
hey, how we doing? How we doing? How we doing?
The chat is, the people are here. Uhuru, everyone. The chat, the chat is having conversation. Please feel free to continue to put your questions, even if you have questions that we weren't able to answer in the previous section. Make sure you put more questions in the chat, because I think just even this conversation that we're having, we're just scratching the surface of it in terms of understanding the politics of what's going on in Africa, but also understanding how to bridge and connect and then analyze what's happening there to what's happening here. I mean, I think that there's so much, especially when we're thinking about the land question and what I've seen being done here around the land question as it relates to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, and the way in which they're thinking about land back and moving about land back, especially in being in a settler colonial society where the settlers are the majority. And so, just thinking about those things, as well as, the Black consciousness, as we're talking about, as Steve Biko talked about in the video.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Armando, can you hear us? Armando, I think I see you. I see you, but I'm not sure if the connection, if I can hear you. Armando, maybe you can try turning off your camera. Okay. Okay, so Armando's is my comrade from Namibia, and we're trying to get him in. He's trying to get his thing through. I'll jump in with just some brief things to kind of give some folks some sense of Namibia and what has happened, because Namibia's elections followed South Africa's. So in the region, South Africa, in the English-speaking region of Southern Africa, is the dominant, if you will, country. It has the population, the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens in South Africa and in Zimbabwe is very influential for the region, right? And so as we have spoken about in the beginning, you're seeing this wave of the African liberation movements that came to power through armed struggle, that pushed a socialist vision, that pushed a broadly mass movement vision, right? A redistribution vision. You're seeing many of them being called to task for the not meeting many of these promises, and you're seeing a new generation over the last 30 years, for example, come in, right, who is now no longer viva 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 comrades comrades comrades, right, and is now shifting to different things, right. And I think it's important that I think for many of us, I see people in the chat sort of so shocked by this, etc. But the reality is again, Black people have voted for Trump and the Republicans for a long time, right? You have your Latinx population, right, for a long time, right? And let's even give something more concrete, and then I'll jump to Namibia, right? Think, for example, right now, those of you who are familiar with some of the struggles within the Seminole Nation, the Black Seminoles, the freedmen, right? Talking about who deserves to get some of this money from the state, et cetera, who has access to land in the reservations, right? Think of that. Think of some of the stuff right now that many of the Republicans have tried to push and others have tried to push, talking about, well, these Latinx folks are coming here taking Black people's jobs. And they don't care about Black folk anyway because they're anti-Black too. Not saying that's not true, but you guys understand that there's tensions here and people are now voting multiple ways in local places because of some of those things. I see we have a fan of AES there, and there's some stuff we'll talk about that later. So real brief, Namibia. I'm going to try to share screen again, and this time we'll move to Namibia, and I'll just do some brief stuff to kind of just connect some of the dots, and then as my colleague hopefully is able to join us, we'll try to get some, dispatches from the grassroots. So this is Namibia right here. Okay, as you can see, we border South Africa is to the south and south east of us, right here. I should also mention, as a form of transition, Botswana right here. Botswana also had a huge transition itself in their government, right? The Botswana Democratic Party, which has been in power since the mid 1960s, they actually lost for the first time since 1965. They have dominated Botswana's elections, and they lost to a new party just now called the UDC, Umbrella for Democratic Change. So that also was a big thing if you think about some of the regional folks who were in power. Now, Namibia is right here, right? So Namibia, the Southwest Africa People's Organization was the dominant organization that sort of led the armed struggle in the 1970s and 80s, and was the most popular organization that came into power in 1990, and has been in power since 1990. Right. So in a similar wave, though, I would say, right, you have had a newer generation that's saying, okay, cool. Well, our lives don't feel like it's changed, right? The corruption is real on all sides, right? And I'll give some concrete examples of some of that right now, right? Even though, yes, if you were to compare life in Namibia, South Africa, certain types of metrics with other places, people will be like, wow, why y'all complaining, whatever, right? But that's not the point, right? The point is that people are wanting to have a life that they want to live, and it's not being answered. So in this last elections, to give some brief numbers, so Namibia, SWAPO party did win, and we elected for the first time in our history the first woman president, right? President Netumbo Nandi Ndaitwa, right? Some of us know her. She's was a young Black woman who joined the armed camps as a young, I want to say 15, 16-year-old. She was in the armed wing of the movement. She eventually transitioned to different parts of movement work, right? This is her right here. She's very, very, I would say an old school left comrade. In ways, which is important because she has a sense of the third world of BRICS and these kinds of things, but still also is thinking of states, and very much SWAPO, while it has not, I think, gone as deep as the ANC in terms of some of the deep levels of just white monopoly capital has penetrated all sides of it. SWAPO most definitely also has moved similar ways, right? The neoliberalism is not just like a moment or something in a particular country, it is a wave. And so SWAPO most definitely has fallen into that, right? And so generally speaking, SWAPO would have generally gotten 70% of the vote, 72% of the vote, these kinds of numbers, so that they can have a 2/3 majority. What's important with the 2/3 majority that I think people need to understand, and why it matters so much, is that when you bring your people into power, okay, for those who want to look right now, what are some of the issues some of the Democrats are having with some of the Republicans right now, or Trump's picks for some of these positions? He's putting his own people into power, right? He's even putting some of his own people into power who are not in the Republican established tradition either. Those of you who are watching, he's actually not doing that either. He's putting people who are loyal to him. Matt Gaetz has never been a particularly standard Republican, right? But he's his boy, right? And he tried to push him in, right? And so you can imagine what has happened when some of these movements came into power. And because the state does have particular control over certain natural resources in Namibia, South Africa, on the diamond mines, the tourism, the state has a very strong influence on these things, right? Given some of the socialist influence politics. So what ends up happening is a lot of people who are now winning political power, you are put in charge of these ministries or these different bureaus, and you're able to accumulate in cake, right, from that, right? And so a lot of people have been resisting and critiquing some of this corruption. And what you have found is that we went from the 70s SWAPO, right? My father, SWAPO member. I was raised in SWAPO. I'm no longer a member of SWAPO, but I very much am raised by that movement, right? Neoliberalism. I'll define that right now, Don Hammonstein. I'll define that. What you end up seeing is it goes from 70%, and this election it was roughly in the mid 50s. So a 15% drop. And I think that drop will continue. SWAPO is right now in 2024 where the ANC was in 2019. So my belief is that in the next 5 years, SWAPO will also go down below 50%, and they're going to have to have a coalition. In part, some of this is also, in addition to some of the other, the capitalist forces and all those things we can talk about, part of also what Phurah was alluding to and what has been hitting some of our movements is the age question. Okay. My dad is in his early 70s. For many in the movement, he is considered a young boy. Okay. And this tells you, okay, what all you need to know. If my dad is apparently the youth. All right. I don't know, Natasha. We in trouble. So, you know what I'm saying? But you know how these old heads be. You know what I'm saying? Like the ageism is real. You know what I mean? And so what has happened is you do have a generation straight up. They're coming from the rural villages. They're coming from apartheid. They're coming from a different world. And then now all of a sudden, this technical world, social media, internet, the new way the city has been developing. Windhoek, the capital city of Namibia, has never been as urbanized and as racially diverse and as filled with capital accumulation as what's beginning to emerge now. It has never happened that way, right? So you can imagine you have a generation of folks that now are in some of the positions of power, but they don't have the new qualifications. They don't have the degrees from the universities. They don't have the certifications, right? Their command of the English language, if you will, which we all know the European language is still on the African continent. That is your route to currency and to higher wages, right? It just is what it is, right? We know in the Black American example, do you talk that good English, or you talk country, or you got that pigeon in you, or you got that, you know what I'm saying? We all know about our own biases around the language, right? So it's not, or the sanctification of a proper English, right? So it ain't just an African thing, it's a global thing, right? In the Black world. So what has happened is that SWAPO did get challenged. In the last election 5 years ago, and the challenge came from inside the party, similar to the ANC. Many of these national liberation movements had multiple wings. You had your left wing, you had your moderates, and you had your conservatives, right? I would say our current president, President Netumbo, I would broadly put her in the broad left wing, if you will, say center left wing, although trying to also hold the wider conservative wing as well, if you will, right? But there was a split among some of the conservative wing of SWAPO by a man named Panduleni Itula. Itula, Bambu himself, which is important, from the north of the country. I'll speak more about that in a bit. He essentially split from the party and decided to run for elections, right? There was some confusion around certain things, but he got about 20% of the vote last time, and basically got similar numbers this time, about 25% of the vote. And then a bunch of some of the other smaller ethnic groups in the center and south part of the country, their particular political parties also were able to get 4 and 5%, which has led to this erosion of this dominant SWAPO used to have. Okay, and so it's very similar-ish to the ANC, but not the same. And so what you do find is you have a younger generation that's pushing for something different, that's critical of the old heads, that's wanting something different. Many of the old heads don't want to let go of power. Maybe close, and maybe Natasha, if you have some questions, comments, thoughts, maybe on Namibia, some details, I'll kick it to you. But just to sort of look at neoliberalism, I'll give it this definition. Essentially, what neoliberalism is, in the classic sense, it emerges in the mid to late 1970s as the world economy begins to restructure itself and break apart what had been emerging since the 1930s and even the 1920s, of course, earlier in Europe, which is the welfare state. So essentially, you're having these higher taxes, in order to have healthcare services, certain guarantees for employment, et cetera, et cetera. If you think of the US FDR's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, if you will, that of course was very racist and was not equally distributed, but you can think of the New Deal in that sense, right? So sort of you have this building up of this welfare state in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s going into the 1960s and 70s. Neoliberalism emerges. The literature is rich as to why and how it emerges, but just in a brief, it emerges as a movement to sort of push back at the power of the welfare state, to sort of argue the state is too much in people's lives. Yes, there was an EFF in Namibia. Bluntly, they didn't do anything. They may not like me saying that, but they have been very irrelevant. Too much sloganeering, no grassroots base, and I could say a lot more. And they may not like me, but life will move on. But essentially what neoliberalism does is it's a movement that emerges with Reagan in the US, Thatcher in England, and others, and essentially trying to attack healthcare, attack education, attack a number of these other state-driven institutions that the masses apparently need, that the masses need, right? It hit the African continent through structural adjustment. Places like Kenya, for example, got hit heavy. Tanzania, Nigeria, essentially to cut education that the independence movements were pushing heavy, cut healthcare, cut roads. The idea is to cut all this government spending, right? That's bloated government. You've heard these combos in the US, bloated government, deficits. Let's cut all this spending, frivolous spending, right? In order to let the market and the market do what it does. So neoliberal essentially is this attack on the welfare state that now is essentially trying to remove some of the small protections states were able to make at a particular point in time in the mid-20th centuries, and then to allow market forces and free market capitalism more of a reign, not just in states, but also globally. So, and this is what has led to then within this breaking of the healthcare and say education, to pick those two: increased military spending, increases, lower taxes for businesses and corporations, right? Less services for the masses, right? And basically saying we have to deal with these things and tighten our belts as the richer get richer, essentially, right? So sort of this is what your neoliberalism moment is in some senses. So let me pause there. Natasha, I don't know if you have any questions, comments, thoughts. I could say more, but yeah.
I guess I'm just thinking around, particularly was thinking about occupied Azania, but also thinking about Namibia in terms of who's in power, the age factor that is coming in, and that although you have, those who are in power being like they were saying, like you were mentioning before, okay, they might not have degrees and they're in power because they used to be part of the movements for independence. And then the new people saying, the younger generation saying, okay, well, we haven't seen anything. You haven't done anything, right? You haven't put us in a position for us to move forward, to build upon something that you've created, and to build upon the work that has been significant so that we can get to the next level. And I think that there's, one of the things that I was thinking about, and we know that this is something that is happening here, that has happened here in the United States as well. The erosion of the connection between the youth and the elders, and the fact that we don't have this information that is important, that be not just passing on the struggle, but also passing on the knowledge. And I think that that's part of the reason of what we're seeing in terms of like what you're saying, because I think about it here within the US in particular too, about how we have elders that are here, but also who knows about the elders, going back to even education and the lack thereof of this kind of information, to know that it is important to seek that out and to come to a place where we're connecting instead of, being divided in terms of when it comes to the age thing. So that was one of the main things that I'm thinking of, because I think a youth population without the knowledge of the history to move in a way that you're not going to repeat what happened in the past, you're putting yourself in a position to just undergo the same thing that your ancestors went through and that they were fighting to get past. And those of us who, and those elders who are in positions that are unwilling to train up their replacements, in a sense, you're also putting the youth in a position to, again, just go through the same things that we went through. And so I think that that is something that we need to be thinking about and looking at in terms of how do we move when we're thinking about how do we move here within the West, those of us who live outside of Africa, and also how do we move in Africa, and how does then that help us also to strengthen this Pan-African movement, internationalist movement that we're wanting to aim for? Because that's, the things that are going on now, we can see these examples of this stuff in the past, like we've mentioned. And it's at a point where we need to be like, okay, enough with the games in terms of that. Like, how do we really put aside egos, put aside, rhetoric, and do some of the hard things and understand that, like, just like one of the things that we mentioned before, these class lines, that Europeans, they're working across class lines to make sure that they maintain their economic position. And so for us, how do we make sure, okay, yeah, there's contradictions, there's things that we don't agree with, but how do we say, okay, well, the main point is for us to become liberated and become in a better political, economic, sovereign position? Because I think also too, the sanctions question is one of the things that I'm always thinking about when we think about why certain governments are unwilling to take particular positions in Africa, and the sanctions that will come from the West, and that will cripple, the economy and the everyday experiences and the everyday lives of the people who are in the country. And we've seen that with Zimbabwe in terms of, the sanctions that have been placed on Zimbabwe. And so what does that do? How does that impact the other countries that are around Zimbabwe in that southern portion of Africa? So I think that's another thing that we don't often talk too much about and don't see, but it is really, I think, a major thing that is another tool that is being used to make sure that these countries don't actually see independence, and that's something that the youth will also have to think about when they get into position. And I think if you haven't moved to a power position, you're going to fall victim to the same things that you can critique these people who are in the positions currently about not doing certain things because of the fact that you know that there are consequences for going toward and activating the Black agenda.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. And the sanctions question is big. And the sanctions question is big because of the capital accumulation question, right? So the reality is that many of these liberation movements, people, and again, and we have to just say this is where when we speak across the ocean, as much as we are connected, there are differences. The reality is in Namibia and South Africa and say Zimbabwe and let's say Mozambique and Angola, our elders in the liberation movements are Hueys, Eldridge Cleavers, Kathleen Cleavers, whatever. We can keep on Malcolm X's. They won political power and came into office. For a lot of others in different places, they were shot and they became martyrs, right? And so the relation, or they went to prison. Right. So for many on the US side, right, we're now fighting for people to get out of prison. Right. Some of our elders have just passed away after being 30 years, 20 years, 50, 30, whatever many years in prison. Right. And so I think there's a difference in that in the African, for some of us, the elders have utilized the elder position to silence dissent. And so that's why I don't think, and even the history that they're trying to bring, remember, we are trying to build a Western education system within a continent that for most of this existence, you didn't go to a school in that sense, outside if you were in the Quranic schools, perhaps when Islam is now making its way across Africa, to now learn this stuff and sit in class with your uniform and you write your test, right? And then you now know things and you go. I went through the Namibian system. There is no history on SWAPO and the liberation struggle and a grassroots radical understanding of Namibian history. The Germans have written it, right? We don't actually have those tools. Even in the US, I'm teaching African American history to 1865, and I'm teaching it in a different kind of a way. It's breaking the hearts of my students because all they've ever told about our lives prior to 1865 was we're being whipped. There was Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and apparently Abraham Lincoln gave you freedom. What do we expect? And they have been attacking and closing off routes for political education and transformation outside the schools to force us to become workers in a particular way, to believe and think in a particular way. In the Namibian example, this stuff is similar. And many of the elders have been behind it. I'm sorry. They have not fought hard enough against it. In Namibia right now, I really wanted Armando to be on this conversation. He is of Nama descent. This matters because the Nama and Herero in the early 20th century were wiped out in a genocide by the Germans. This is important because 90 to 95% of their population got hit. Why is this important? It's important because in the north of the country where I'm from, our people were not hit by that genocide. So our population in a particular kind of a consciousness that had come from certain years of struggle against slavery in the north in Angola and other types of movements was more intact, given what happened, right, to the Herero and Nama. So that now when SWAPO emerges, its basis is with the Vambu community in the north. We generally, for example, our liberation struggle, for example, while yes, we were based similar to a Bantustan, we were pushed into the north of the country. If I share my screen really quickly, maybe I'll give this to kind of speak a little bit about this as we then maybe wrap up a little bit given time. But if we look at a map right here, I'm going to zoom in. I am from the north of Namibia, which is essentially this region here. See, here's your Angolan border, and then here's, if you will, what they call the Vambu portion of Namibia, right? This area right here generally has been the heartbeat. You see Tsumeb is some of the mining towns, copper mines, other types of gold mines and stuff over here, right? This area here essentially has been the Vambu stronghold, if you will, and that has been the center of SWAPO support. right? You also, because of the numbers, and this is where we're similar to the Zulus in ways, you have a migrant population that was pushed to the mines and to become wage laborers on the farms in the cities, precisely because the Europeans committed genocide against the Herero and Nama, and so they didn't have the waged workers, right, to run the colony the way they needed to run it, right? And so that's why SWAPO begins as a union movement first, by my namesake, right? And then it becomes this national liberation movement. You had other things like the Herero Chiefs Council and other types of movements that were also happening throughout the struggle, particularly in the early 20th century. A lot of the radical leadership was in the center and south of the country, although of course the north. So Vukoni, in terms of taking back land, I'll say no. Why? And this is why I'm talking about things as I'm talking about it. For us Vamus in the north, we did not have the vicious land seizure like those in the center and south of Namibia did. So for us, we generally had more of our land, although we were boxed into the north in a similar kind of a Bantustan situation. And so, as population grows, the land you have gets subdivided smaller and smaller. But there still is a sense of certain kinds of land ownership and a sense of where we are. Versus Armando and others who are in the center and the south of the country, their relationship to the land would be similar to more Native Americans or Black freedmen who have been dispossessed of their land. And even in a quote unquote radical government afterwards, it was not returned to them. And that's also because, as you all know, many of our African peoples, most of us don't have a conception of land as private ownership. We don't understand the concept of private ownership or land, or you must only stay in this 100 acres. It is not how many people in the center and south, and most of the Africans have been mobilizing historically. We have been a mobile population. Why? Namibia is predominantly desert. You can't stay in one place for more than a certain amount of time. Right? And so because of this, SWAPO has not given back the land to people in the center and the south. Many of these, the land, Herero land, Nama land, other places is still owned by white farmers and white settler colonialists. And there's reasons for that. And part of the reasons for that is because the Russians, with their perestroika and with their glasnost, and then withdrawing support of the African liberation movements at a key point in our history, SWAPO wanted to invade through Angola and conquer Namibia, not just have elections. That is absolutely true. And by conquering Namibia, the idea was to take land from the whites and to return it in that sense. Because the Russians withdrew support, we didn't have the mechanization to be able to win that kind of a conflict. Hence, the free and fair elections becomes the middle ground, with the idea that we would slowly buy back land slowly over time, similar to South Africa. Right, and there were blockages in the Constitution to prevent a rapid land redistribution policy. And so what has now happened is much of the resistance to SWAPO is coming from now the recovering populations of the Herero, Nama, so-called colored, and even the younger Vambu populations who are now in the cities. Note the difference between the city consciousness and the rural village consciousness, right? SWAPO is key in the rural areas, not in the cities, right? Similar to the ANC, right? What ends up happening now is you have a newer consciousness that's emerging in the urban city center, particularly Windhoek, and some of the places on the coast, Swakopmund, and other places in the north, but predominantly Windhoek right now, that is now not just enamored with the elders in the liberation movement, because they have also been very much part of the poverty people are still living in right now. An example that I'll give, and I'll close off real quick, is that SWAPO right now, if you go to Namibia on the route to Katutura is basically the hood, the big township in Windhoek, right? That's like the Bronx, for those of you in New York City, right? And that's where the heartbeat of the city, I would say, is, right? But that's what it is, right? The hood, right? When you drive through the hood from the richer areas of town, there's what's called the Katutura Hospital when you look on your left of the major road leading into Katutura. It was done, I think, in the 1970s or something like this. It's like an old... It's just it's overrun, the hospital. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's better than some, but it's not as good as it needs to be. And in Namibia, remember, healthcare for us, is more socialized. So it's not so much about insurances and these things. You will get seen. The question is like, how long, the level of care, the capacity, et cetera, right? And so Katutura Hospital, right, is there basically falling apart. And then SWAPO gets a tender from the Chinese and some other folks, and right across is builds sort of is rebuilding the SWAPO headquarters for Namibia, and they basically are building a huge deluxe looking hotel type situation right across from the falling apart hospital that people are waiting wild lines to get into. But you would build literally right, I'm not even joking with you, it's right across the street. How? And you claim to be socialist. And that's what some of the elders also on this side of the Atlantic, you cannot just be supporting SWAPO because you liked them 20 years ago. We ain't 20 years ago. Time has moved on, right? And so you coming out in support of some of these cats alienates you from the Black internationalism that we want, from the local folks on the ground who are suffering from some of these things right now. So we have to be very specific and clear of what we are talking about, right? When we talk about solidarity and global Black solidarity, right? And I'll close with this, and then maybe if we have some little conversation, then we can close up. One of the strongest movements that has emerged over the last 5 years, like strong, strong, is the young Black feminists. Note how I've defined that. Young Black feminists, because they're not necessarily down with the new Black woman president, if you will. Because as you know, just because she's a Black woman don't necessarily mean she got womanist feminist politics. And so there's a young Black feminist movement, and then there is a LGBTQ movement also emerging. NACFA is here, and some of the BAP folks, we did some discussions a couple months ago about some of those movements recently, particularly this last summer in 2024. They overturned some of the sodomy laws. Y'all will know that, there was also a huge thing on the continent around the sodomy laws, basically these homophobic and transphobic laws that have been pushed in these African states, across the way, right? And finally, the High Court in Namibia overturned some of these sodomy laws, right? And it was a huge thing, of course, happening within a legal framework, but part of what pushed it being overturned is the grassroots movement that had emerged around it coming out of COVID. Because during COVID, what began to happen, as y'all know, we were forced to shelter in place, and so domestic abuse cases rose. And so within that rise of domestic abuse cases, there was a huge movement of people that say this has been happening for as long, and the government has not been fighting against gender-based violence, has not been fighting against the homophobia and transphobia and the violence against queer folks in Namibia, etc. And we are making a stand against this. And so a number of people began to emerge to fill in this vacuum. And that was big also in pertains to the election, because this younger population is not voting, but also is not aligned to any of the mainstream political parties. And they are moving outside the state, but in the NGO route, as well as some other grassroots spaces as well. So I think for those of you who want to think of solidarity with Namibia in particular, I would say you have to look at these movements. SWAPO, while it is important, right now it is the state. And for all intents and purposes, in many elements, it is not our friend. It is very much the representative of capital in Namibia, as well as, of course, having potentials to do more, but not doing so. Right. But so I think when you talk about solidarity, these are the people you need to be looking for, and to be giving people different routes to kind of express themselves. Because part of what's also happening here is that you do have your white European NGO industrial complex that, because of the differences in exchange rates and the amount of finances that they have, they can basically uplift and support some of the queer and Black women, some of the poor women's, homeless people's struggles, to kind of show, as Natasha was saying last time, where you see these Africans can't run themselves. You see the radical movement is gay and sexist. You see what I'm saying, right? In as much as they're helping many people, it's true they're giving and providing safe spaces for a lot of people. They are, no question about it. But then when it comes to now also fighting for land, so for example, when there's queer folks who are being killed, or when certain laws need to be changed, the white allies and the NGO folks are all in the protest and all vocal. But now when the queer folks are now fighting for land back as Black queer people in Namibia, then the white people disappear. You see? So this is what we talk about the LGBTQ movement. We must penetrate its also nature itself. And so many of the LGBTQ folks who are in Windhoek are disproportionately Nama, Herero, and other ethnic groups that are not Bambu, as well as the younger Bambu population that grew up in the cities, not in the rural areas. And so then they also have a different orientation to the larger part of Namibia, the larger government structure, if you will. So I'm going to pause there and sort of say that sort of is what was at stake. I do want to give some other percentages of people who won stuff. One person in particular, I think people do need, well, a couple people should pay attention to. Panduleni Itula, you should pay attention to him, and we'll leave some of these links in the stuff. Basically, he got the second most votes. He split from SWAPO. Basically, was backed by the British. The British gave him a whole bunch of money, and he made some weird promises about giving people money and handouts and stuff, or whatever he was trying to do. He's not on a leftist critique of SWAPO. I would say a right wing critique of SWAPO, if you will. Think of him as like a black DA almost in some ways. He may not like this, but I don't care. But he did get 20% of the vote, and as a Vambu, this matters. If you remember earlier, I said Vambus are, if you will, the dominant population. It's decisive. It is like about 2/3 of the population. And we have about 13 different ethnic groups, right? So imagine one group is 2/3 and the other 12 are within the third. So you can imagine so it's not, and that's not the same like in Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, where it's more like 20%, 15%, 12%, more equitable in that kind of a way, right? For us, it is decisive. And so Ntula was important because he split the Vambu vote. Because the majority of the people in Namibia and the voters are in the north. So he split the Vambu vote. And that's why you see in large part SWAPO's numbers dropping, as well as people who are not voting. Okay. And so that's one thing. So Itula is important. He's backed by the British. He hasn't really been trying to hide it. But there you go. The next person who I think is interesting that people should think about is Job Amupanda. Job used to be in the SWAPO Youth League. I'm not sure if he still officially is. Also his membership in SWAPO, I think he still is a member of SWAPO, but he was very key about 10 years ago. 10, 15 years ago in this movement called AR, affirmative repositioning. Think of it as kind of developing as a young, progressive, urban, city-based petty bourgeois movement, sort of critiquing the elders using certain terminologies, anti-imperialism, land redistribution, calling out some of the corruption, calling out some of the ageism, speaking to a larger Black and African international, if you will, and sort of emerging as an internal critique for SWAPO, and then eventually they formed their own political party. They, I think, did relatively well in this election with 6.6% of the vote, meaning that he does have a constituency. And then after that, I would say McHenry Vanani of the PDM, and then Bernardo Swartboy of the LPM. Swartboy is and Vanani are in the, if you will, Herero and Nama, and they're in the middle and center part of the country. I wouldn't say that they're leftist progressive as people in the West like to define this stuff. I would still say some of their economic policy is more, if you will, not put it this way, not trying to fight neoliberalism, but the LPM is called the Landless People's Movement, and sort of they emerge sort of feeling that you Vambus in the north don't take land redistribution seriously in the center and south, particularly the south, so we have to fight for this ourselves, if you will. And I would agree with them. As someone from the north, yes, we have failed them. And I think we have to take responsibility for that, and since we have failed them in the south and we have failed them to white supremacy. That's why I wanted Armando here, because he represents those people, right? And I think that SWAPO has done a horrible job speaking to that and fighting to have people get people their land back. So let me pause there. If there's any maybe last minute questions and thoughts about this, and then maybe we can close off. Thank you so much, folks, who stuck with us the entire time. It didn't go in terms of planning as much as as exact as I would like, but it is what it is.
I don't really see too many questions in particular. One question someone had was, did the sanctions come from trying to take land back and giving it to the people?
Yes. In Zimbabwe?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Okay, so essentially, long story short, what happened is that, remember, okay, in the beginning of our talk today, I talked about how ZANU-PF was prevented from changing the constitution in 1990, even though they had the 2/3 majority to do so. They could not make a change to the constitution for 10 years. And then in the constitution, in the Lancaster Accords, 1979, you can check that out. And then in addition to that, you needed a 2/3 majority in order to change the constitution. And in the constitution, of course, they put you cannot redistribute land, if you will, like, respecting land ownership, if you will. Those of you think of your Haitian constitution in 1805, 1806, property is protected in the Haitian constitution. As much as radicals, we love that constitution, property is protected. And whenever you protect property in your constitution, that right there is the foundation for capital accumulation. Just there's not much debate about it, right? And so what ends up happening is that as 10 years passed, part of the agreement to get Mugabe to sign that agreement and ZANU to assign and kind of push the agreement to their masses was to say the British would give half, if you will, or would give a percentage of what the whites then claimed as payment to get the land that they wanted back, certain land back, whatever. When the time came to have the bill due, the British fudged and reneged on their agreement. Right. And so then you have this tit for tat in the early 1990s, mid 1990s, and then leading into the late 1990s, some of the military veterans from ZANU. ZANU was always, its heartbeat of the radicalness of ZANU was in the armed wing. and the cultural grassroots wing. I would argue it was not in the political leadership. The political leadership, like Mugabe and others, were chosen simply because they speak English good. They speak that white man English good, and he know what they saying. Some of us, they don't speak that English that good. We speak English our third, fourth, fifth language, and Mugabe speak that good English. Go listen to Mugabe's early 1970s English. My goodness, this is a good British citizen right here. Like, go listen to that British accent, homie. It's on point. And so, and I'm being facetious, but it's true, and we know it's true, right? You think of Dr. King, all these cats, he talk that good English. You know what I'm saying? It's just real, right?
Yeah.
The Caribbean, the same, etc. Right? And so essentially what ends up happening is these military veterans, they are struggling. We are supposedly independent for 10, 15 years. We're now poor. We're homeless. We're not getting our checks for our struggle. We can't compete in this waged economy. These whites still own the majority of the land here. They're racist against us, treating us like shit, etc., etc. No, we are going to go take some of this land back. And there have been discussions about 1,500 farms or areas of land that was like underutilized. That was not, so it was underutilized land, and some land that was utilized. And so spontaneously, these groups took this land. Mugabe was not behind it, in as much as he claimed responsibility for it later on, after it was seen how popular it was, and after he got kicked out from the Western community, if you will. Then he began to embrace it as if it was his idea. It was not his idea. He was against it. And what he got hit with sanctions for was not land distribution. What he got hit with sanctions for is that he did not shoot at those cats who went to go get land. Because he did not tell the army to shoot at them, right, as he could have, as he did in the 80s with the Gukarundi, right, right, against the Ndebele, right, in Ndebele land, right, in the 1980s, he did not shoot. That's why he got sanctions hit on him, right? And so that's essentially what happened. And with that happening, a lot of ZANU's cash crops got, blocked from the international market, some of the diamonds and gold. But that's where then now China and some of the BRICS began to emerge to fill in that gap, etc. And when the people did take that land, what they did, and what now even the British have to acknowledge themselves, the areas of land that was taken, what they did was stop some of the tobacco production, cotton production, these like export cash crops, and now began to grow things that are indigenous to the area and food crops, etc. So yes, your foreign currency dropped and your exports dropped, but your foods for nourishment and those kinds of environmental regeneration crops, they did take root, and that did accelerate. But that essentially was the sanctions around Zimbabwe, and it was a warning to Namibia, South Africa, and the rest of us, because like Namibia, 65% of our foodstuffs in the stores is imported. Right? If we get hit, all of our oil is imported. Until recently, we just found oil. That's actually a big thing I forgot to say. Namibia has found oil. Hydrogen deposits of this hydrogen gas and oil, whatever. It's a lot of it. And it's going to transform the economy over the next 20, 25 years. Ghana has found similar things. I'm not happy with this, of course. Whenever we find oil, here we go. But that has happened. And hence the elections that are coming up are going to be very big, because then the question will come: distribution of the wealth of the oil. Are you going to build up sources? What's the vision, et cetera, et cetera? It's part of why the British made their move now to support Itula, to break at SWAPO, because now with the oil going to come online in the next 10 years or so, it's going to matter.
So there you have it, folks. You have it. You don't have all of it, but you have some of it for sure. And like Toivo said, thank you so much for sticking with us for these 2 hours. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Make sure that you subscribe so you can know when these kinds of shows are coming on. And also make sure you share. And, I saw in the chat that people were saying, like, this is the kind of information that we need to be putting out, instead of making, CNN or ABC or Fox News go, everywhere, spread everywhere. So make sure you definitely share this, and make sure you tune in to We Charge Colonialism so that you can get the information that we need, vital information. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Uhuru.
The white power structure, because that's all we have in America. And the white power structure today is just as much interested in perpetuating slavery as the white power structure was 100 years ago. Only now they use modern methods of doing so. And realizing that the black people in this country are waking up and becoming filled with a desire to be looked upon as men and as human beings. The white power structure, to slow down that struggle for freedom and human dignity, uses tricks. 100 years ago they could do it with chains. Today they use tricks. And one of the tricks that they've invented is this token integration, to get Negroes, so-called Negro leaders, to accept a few token crumbs of integration that don't solve any problem for the masses of black people in this country whatsoever, but it does make the hand-picked Negroes be satisfied to slow down the cry of the masses. And a good example of that is, as soon as the spirit of rebellion or revolution began to spread among the masses of black people in this country, and they began to take an active part, and they showed that they weren't confined to this nonviolent approach, then the government or the power structure began to sit up and take notice and